So he writes in his memoir that his first drink was at 14, and from that moment he felt complete. But the big pivotal moment, and I think a lot of people with opiate addiction can relate to this, he had a jet ski accident in 1997, and he was prescribed Vicodin.
Hi there. Welcome back, or welcome to Recovering Out Loud podcast, the show where we get real about mental health and addiction. I'm so glad you're here. If you or someone you love is struggling with drugs or alcohol, please reach out for help. Send me a message on all social media platforms at Recovering Out Loud Pod or by email at recoveringoutloudpod@gmail.com. You are no longer alone.
All right. Today on Recovering Out Loud, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I wanted to start a People We Lost Too Soon series where I talk about people in the public eye and their struggles with addiction. And if you've ever watched Friends, if you've ever watched Matthew Perry act, he was a really funny actor, beloved as Chandler on Friends. And when I was in rehab this last time in January, I got a chance to read his memoir, which is incredible. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. So a lot of this information is going to be from his memoir. Um, it's called Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing. So highly recommend checking it out. He goes into detail about addiction and his struggles with addictions. He went to multiple rehabs. Unfortunately, as a lot of us know, he didn't make it out of addiction, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to start these episodes. So um, let's dive into it. So we'll start with his early life. His full name is actually Matthew Langford Perry. He was born on August 19th of 1969 in Massachusetts, and his parents divorced before his first birthday. So his mother, Susan, or Suzanne, she was actually Canadian. So shout out to all my Canadian friends and listeners. She worked in politics for, yeah, that's right. She was press secretary for Pierre Trudeau at the time, is Prime Minister of Canada at the time. And so she lived in Ottawa and worked as a press secretary, like I said. His dad's name was John Bennett Perry, and he was an actor and a model. He actually talks about it in a lot of detail in his book. And his parents met on some talk show, or she was a pageant queen in the Canadian side of things. So Matthew Perry grew up mostly in Ottawa, and he was raised mainly by his mom and his stepfather, who was a journalist, Keith Morrison, the guy from Dateline. So he talks about being a kid and having restless energy. He was mischievous, um, and he actually admitted to beating up Pierre Trudeau's son, a lot of us might know, the former prime minister, most recently former prime minister Justin Trudeau, and during the schoolyard days. So that's kind of funny. He actually kicked his ass. Matthew Perry really liked tennis. He became one of the top junior players in Canada, but then he moved to Los Angeles at the age of 15 to live with his dad, as probably any kid would. He didn't really pursue tennis. It's funny, he actually goes into quite a lot of detail in his book about riding on the plane alone and uh, and how that really affected him down the road, being alone on an airplane and being filled with fear as a child, because he did it quite a bit. So he moved to LA at 15, and then he wanted to become an actor, as most people who move to LA want to do. He started with small roles, a show called Charles in Charge, Growing Pains, and Sydney. The story of him actually getting into Friends and becoming Chandler Bing is actually sort of an act of providence. It's a funny coincidence how it happened. I remember when I was reading it in rehab, I was actually quite blown away how it was supposed to go to someone else, the role, and then it went to him. So I'll explain that a little bit. So originally, Perry was committed to another pilot of a show called LAX 2194. Ever heard of it? No, neither did I. So it was a kind of a weird idea for a show. It was about baggage handlers in the future. And then the project eventually fell through. He was free to audition. So he auditioned for the role of Chandler Bing. And it was actually funny. One of his one of his good friends, I'm blanking on the name right now, originally got cast for the role. And Chandler was the last role to be cast in the show Friends. So one of his good buddies, who's also an actor, obviously, got cast for the role, and he had two roles to choose from at the time. This guy, um, and he actually called Matthew Perry and said, "Which one should I take?" And Matthew Perry really wanted the role of Chandler, and he talks about in his book he had a real internal battle where he wanted to tell him not to take Chandler from Friends because he wanted that role, and he went with his better judgment and went with his heart and was a good friend and said, "No, you should take the role of Chandler from Friends." And then his friend actually decided to take the other role of a different show, and then so the role was open for Matthew Perry. Is sort of funny how that worked out, and would end up essentially changing his entire life. He became extremely rich and famous from that role, as we all know. So Friends, the show Friends premiered in 1994, and Chandler's one-liner that a lot of you might know made him a fan favorite overnight. I don't watch the show that much, but I believe it's something like, "Can I be any more uninterested?" or something like that. I'm probably butchering that, but so this is when he started to really battle the drug addiction and started to come into his life. So he writes in his memoir that his first drink was at 14, and from that moment he felt complete. But the big pivotal moment, and I think a lot of people with opiate addiction can relate to this. He had a jet ski accident in 1997, and he was prescribed Vicodin, right? So he would start with the Vicodin for the pain, and then it escalated pretty quickly. He started taking 55 pills a day, as he talks about. So by his own count, he went to rehab 15 times. So if you're out there listening to this and you've been to rehab a lot, like there's people like you, and you don't have to go out the way he went out. He spent over $9 million trying to get sober, right? Not just from rehabs, but from therapists and other type of addiction treatments. So he was hospitalized so many times that at one point his colon actually burst and he was put into a coma for 2 weeks. He talks about it in his book, the story of how he was in extreme pain and he was trying to leave the current rehab that he was at, but they wouldn't let him leave because they deemed it as drug seeking behavior, and they thought that he just wanted to go to the hospital to get opiates. So the guy at the treatment center actually stood in front of his car and wouldn't let his assistant, who was driving at the time, he wouldn't let Matthew Perry and his assistant leave. Matthew Perry was in so much pain from his colon. He didn't know it at the time that his colon burst, but he would later find that out. That he actually told his assistant, "Just drive, run the guy over," and they got the guy jumped out of the way, and they went to the hospital. So he was put into a coma for 2 weeks. He had 14 stomach surgeries, and he lived with a colostomy bag for 9 months. He makes a joke in his book about being full of shit. He was literally full of shit. Like his colon burst and exploded everywhere. He almost died in that moment. Also, all through this, he was filming Friends, and he actually admits to not remembering filming 3 entire seasons of the show. He doesn't remember 3 full seasons. He actually talks about it in his book as well, where he says in the show, when you go back and watch, when he has a goatee, the facial hair, he has a goatee. That's when he was on opiates and heavily addicted to painkillers. And then when he doesn't, you can tell the difference. He looks completely different. He's sober when he doesn't have the goatee. So his castmates started to notice, specifically Jennifer Aniston. She pulled him aside once and said, "We know you're drinking." And he talks about how that moment stuck with him. It was the first time he realized that he couldn't hide it anymore, and other people started to notice. I think a lot of us can relate to that, where it's like you're doing a good job, you're not hurting anyone else, you're hiding it, and then someone in your life comes up to you and says, "Hey, man, like you need some help, you have a problem," and this kind of you have the kind of experience where you're like, "Oh man, I got to change because I got to do something about this because now it's not just affecting me, it's affecting people around me and people I love." So I find this extremely powerful, and I resonate a lot with this, even though I wasn't addicted per se to opiates. I did have my experience with them. But he talks about quote, the first time I took Vicodin, it felt better than anything I'd ever experienced. And the problem was that feeling stayed with me. He actually talks about in his book, he likens it to your when you take opiates, your blood, it feels like your blood is replaced with warm honey. That's how he described the feeling of opiates. I think a lot of us can relate to that, this sort of warm hug feeling. So Matthew dated Perry dated quite a bit of incredible women. He dated Julia Roberts, Lizzie Kaplan, but he talks a lot about his fear of abandonment from his childhood and how it often sabotaged his relationships. He talks about how he used humor as a shield to keep people out and keep people at a distance. So in 2022, Perry released his memoir that I talked about earlier. Highly, I recommend it quite heavily. That doesn't make any fucking sense. Just go and read it. It's called Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing. So he wrote it entirely himself, and it was his way of telling the truth before it was too late. Kind of ironic. Then in October of 2023, he passed away at 54 years old. So the autopsy later revealed acute ketamine effects as a factor. He turned his old Malibu mansion into Perry House, which was a sober living facility for men, and now he continues his mission through the Matthew Perry Foundation, which is amazing. He talks about in his book the story about how he started that facility. He went in with a sponsor of his, and then so the guy ended up taking his investment, Matthew Perry's investment, and disappearing. He talks about how that negatively affected him. So when he died, he drowned in his hot tub. He was in his hot tub on ketamine, and he talks about how he was using ketamine from doctors, but then he was this. I could relate to this a lot. He was getting prescribed ketamine, and then he was doctor shopping and getting more pills and ketamine on the side. So the investigations revealed that his assistant, two doctors, and producers were involved in supplying him ketamine for depression treatment. Some pleaded guilty, including they called this woman the ketamine queen, Jasveen Sangha, and his death sparked legal and media scrutiny. So he began drinking at 14, and by 18 he was daily drinking. Like I said, the jet ski accident spun him into a world of opiates. Um, it's funny. It says here he attended 6,000 AA meetings, 14 stomach surgeries, and had a colostomy bag, and spent around $9 million trying to get sober. He had a lot of near-death experiences throughout the time. So he talks about an episode in rehab in Switzerland where Proferol administered before surgery stopped his heart for 5 minutes, resulting in 8 broken ribs due to CPR. So I think there's a lot to learn from this story, and we definitely lost him too soon. But I was really inspired by his story and his memoir. As you know, he wrote it with the intention of helping the still suffering addict and alcoholic, right? There's a lot of good stuff in there and a lot of hope, but ultimately, he got to a point where, in my opinion, he wasn't working some sort of recovery program, and he was looking for that connection. Right? He wasn't, he talks a lot about isolation in his book being a factor, and I can relate to that. Being isolated is literally the key to addiction. Like the biggest fuel. The biggest catalyst to relapse and addiction is being separate from people, from a higher power, and trying to do things on your own, this sort of isolation place that we get ourselves into. He talks about how he broke off engagements when he was sober because he worried he'd hurt his partners if he relapsed, right? Like this constant liability. And there's a quote in his book where he says, when I die, I don't want to be friends, to be the first thing mentioned. I want helping others to be the first thing. Love that. Matthew Perry made the world laugh, but the most powerful thing he left us isn't Chandler Bing's sarcasm, but his brutal honesty and authenticity. Highly recommend checking out this book. It's a great book for people in addiction, people struggling with an addict in their life. Gives some real perspective and the fame side of things. He also talks about Bruce Willis being a huge party animal, which is hilarious. They did a movie together, which is also, you know, a big part of his success. And yeah, I mean, I really wanted to do this because I think it's a really interesting story and a different perspective on being famous and struggling with addiction. But it's all the same shit, you know. I could relate a lot to it, even though he's very different than I am. I can relate a lot to the addiction and the feelings that he talks about in his book, and what drugs did for him, right? This sense of ease and comfort that we start to do drugs, and then we get this sense of ease and comfort that uh, we need to find in sobriety, right? And to me today, the ease and comfort comes from my recovery program. It comes from doing this podcast. It comes from making content, doing the coaching, helping others. And ultimately, I don't want to go back out there, right? Like, I want to stay on this side of the fence because it's a lot better. It's hard at times, but it's worth it. Thanks for listening today. I'm going to be doing a lot more of these episodes coming up. If you have any recommendations, shoot me a message of people you want lost too soon or people struggling with addiction. I'm thinking maybe Charlie Sheen, even though he's still alive. He has a Netflix documentary coming out, but let me know what you think. Like, follow, subscribe. It really helps the channel. I appreciate every single one of you. And let's do this thing one day at a time.
Thanks for listening. Please help us grow the channel and like, share, and subscribe for more content. The discussions and stories shared on this podcast are for informational and motivational purposes only. This content is not a substitute for professional medical advice, addiction treatment, or therapy. If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, please consult a licensed physician, addiction specialist, or mental health professional. You are no longer alone.